The phone rang at exactly 3:07 a.m., cutting through the silence of my empty bedroom like a scream. In 6 years of living alone, no one had ever called me after midnight unless someone had died. I stared at the glowing screen in the darkness. Unknown number. My heart was already pounding as I reached for the phone, expecting news about Amanda's family, about Craig's parents, about someone else I'd have to bury. At 72, middle-of-the-night calls meant only one thing. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse from sleep. "Walter?" The woman's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear and desperation. "Walter, is that you?" My blood turned to ice. No one had called me Walter in 6 years. Everyone called me William, my legal name, the name on my driver's license, the name Amanda had always used. But there was only one person on this earth who'd ever called me Walter, the woman I'd buried 6 years ago. "Who is this?" I managed to say, sitting up in bed, fully awake now. "It's me. It's Sarah. They told me you were dead. They showed me newspaper clippings about an accident, but I found your number hidden in my things. Walter, I'm scared. I don't know where I am, but there are nurses here and they keep giving me pills that make me foggy." The room started spinning. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of cruel hoax, someone who'd learned about Sarah, about our private names for each other. "Sarah died 6 years ago," I whispered. "I went to her funeral. Amanda showed me the death certificate." "No, Walt. I've been in hospitals and facilities for 6 years. They keep telling me I have brain damage, that I can't remember my real life. But I remember you. I remember our yellow kitchen. I remember how you hum while you make coffee. I remember everything." I stayed quiet, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. They mistook my silence for weakness. But whoever was doing this didn't know who I was. They didn't know that I'd spent 35 years investigating insurance fraud and staged deaths. They didn't know that I understood exactly how these schemes worked, how someone could disappear while their family collected death benefits. And this didn't start tonight. It started 6 years ago when Amanda convinced me that Sarah had died, when I'd trusted my daughter's tears and official documents. But now, everything I'd believed was crumbling, and that was only the beginning. The line went dead at 3:11 a.m., leaving me alone in the darkness with the impossible possibility that everything I'd believed for 6 years was a lie. I should have noticed the first sign 6 months earlier when Amanda started asking unusually detailed questions about my daily routine, my medication schedule, and whether I'd been experiencing any memory problems since Sarah's death. But I'd been too consumed with grief to recognize the patterns I'd spent decades investigating in my professional life. 6 years ago, Amanda had come to my house on a Tuesday morning, tears streaming down her face, carrying what appeared to be official documentation from Nevada authorities. She'd held me while I sobbed over Sarah's death certificate, while I planned a funeral for a closed casket, because the accident damage was too severe for viewing. I'd trusted my daughter's grief. I'd trusted the official seals, the proper letterhead, the witness signatures that all looked authentic to a man destroyed by loss. For 6 years, I'd visited what I now realized might be an empty grave, leaving flowers for a woman who was alive and terrified somewhere in the medical system. The cruelest part was how convincing Amanda had been during those early months of my grief. She'd held me during the funeral, helped me sort through Sarah's belongings, been the perfect grieving daughter supporting her devastated father. Every tear had been calculated, every hug had been manipulation. "Walter, I remember our yellow kitchen," the voice had said. Sarah was the only person who'd ever noticed that I'd painted our kitchen yellow, because it reminded her of morning sunshine. I'd never told Amanda about that detail, never mentioned it to anyone after Sarah's supposed death. But now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness, I had to face the terrible possibility that my daughter had stolen 6 years of my life, 6 years of Sarah's life, for money. That while I'd been visiting an empty grave, Sarah had been drugged and confused in some facility, told that I was dead. As a retired insurance fraud investigator, I knew exactly how these schemes worked, but I'd never imagined that my own child would target me for the kind of fraud I'd spent my career prosecuting. I should have noticed the first sign. The next morning felt like walking through a nightmare as I drove to the address the mysterious caller had given me before our connection was lost. Riverside Manor was an expensive private facility 40 minutes from my house, the kind of place that specialized in long-term care for patients with complex medical needs. What the staff didn't know was that I wasn't just a confused elderly man following up on a disturbing phone call. I was Walter Harrison, retired senior investigator for the State Insurance Commission. I'd spent 35 years investigating insurance fraud, staged accidents, and false death claims for financial gain. I'd worked on dozens of cases involving staged deaths where family members collected life insurance while hiding supposedly deceased relatives in remote facilities. I understood medical documentation, legal death certificates, and the sophisticated networks used to create false identities for fraud schemes. But I'd retired 8 years ago, choosing quiet suburban life with Sarah after 4 decades of fighting financial criminals. She'd been the center of my world for 42 years. And when Amanda showed me the accident reports and death certificate, I'd been too devastated to apply my professional skepticism. Amanda had seen my grief and emotional vulnerability, calculating that a retired investigator wouldn't investigate his own wife's death when presented with official documentation by his trusted daughter. She'd researched my professional background, but had assumed that retirement meant I'd lost access to investigative resources. Sarah had always been proud of my work catching insurance fraudsters and identity thieves. She'd kept framed newspaper clippings of major cases I'd solved, commendations from grateful insurance companies whose losses I'd prevented. Amanda was about to learn that targeting a retired insurance fraud investigator for a fake death scheme was the most expensive mistake of her criminal career. But the real shock came later that afternoon when I began tracing the documentation Amanda had used to prove Sarah's death. That afternoon felt like walking through a nightmare when I used my investigative contacts to examine the death certificate Amanda had shown me 6 years earlier. Every instinct I had developed during 3 decades of fraud investigation was now screaming that I'd been systematically deceived. The certificate looks authentic on the surface, my former colleague Detective Morrison explained, spreading documents across his desk at the State Insurance Commission. But there are subtle irregularities in the filing sequence numbers and witness signatures that suggest sophisticated forgery. But the forged death certificate was only part of what appeared to be an elaborate scheme. Morrison had discovered that the accident report from Nevada contained inconsistencies in timing, witness statements, and vehicle identification numbers that indicated systematic falsification. Someone invested significant time and money creating this documentation, Morrison continued. This isn't amateur hour. Whoever orchestrated this had knowledge of legal procedures, access to official forms, and understanding of how death certificates are processed across state lines. Amanda had been planning to fake Sarah's death for months, carefully researching legal requirements while building infrastructure needed to hide her mother in long-term care facilities. She'd calculated that I wouldn't apply professional skepticism to official documents presented during my emotional crisis. There's something else you need to see, Morrison said, pulling out additional files. We ran financial searches on Amanda's accounts for the past 6 years. She's been receiving regular payments from a life insurance policy, Sarah's life insurance policy. The scope of betrayal was breathtaking. Amanda had collected $250,000 in life insurance money while keeping her supposedly dead mother hidden in expensive medical facilities, probably using the insurance funds to pay for Sarah's long-term care while pocketing the remainder. But Amanda had made a critical error in targeting someone with intimate knowledge of insurance fraud investigation. She'd assumed that emotional grief would override professional expertise, that a devastated husband wouldn't investigate documentation that seemed to confirm his worst fears. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But Amanda made her critical mistake when she submitted additional insurance claims 6 months ago, filing paperwork for Sarah's estate settlement that triggered automatic fraud detection systems I'd helped design during my career with the State Insurance Commission. The red flags started appearing when Amanda filed secondary claims related to Sarah's supposed accident, Detective Morrison explained, showing me computer printouts filled with algorithmic alerts, double billing for medical expenses that supposedly occurred before Sarah's death, timeline discrepancies that don't match the original accident report. As a retired fraud investigator, I recognized every pattern Amanda had used. She'd gotten greedy, filing supplemental claims that drew attention from the automated systems I'd spent years developing to catch exactly these types of schemes. There's more, Morrison continued, his voice heavy with professional outrage. We traced the Nevada facilities mentioned in the original accident report. Half of them don't exist, and the ones that do have no record of treating anyone matching Sarah's description on the date specified. The level of premeditation was staggering. Amanda had spent months researching my investigative background, understanding enough about fraud detection to create initially convincing documentation while planning an ongoing scheme to collect insurance money indefinitely. We found correspondence between Amanda and several long-term care facilities, Morrison explained. She's been moving Sarah between different institutions every 6 to 8 months, always paying cash, always using false medical histories that support the brain injury narrative. Amanda had left a digital trail that any competent fraud investigator could follow directly to criminal charges. Her legal background as a paralegal had given her knowledge of documentation procedures, but she'd forgotten that insurance fraud systems maintain comprehensive audit logs. She was about to learn that attempting to deceive a retired insurance fraud investigator was the most expensive mistake of her criminal career. That mistake cost her everything. And I knew the trap was closing around Amanda when Detective Morrison introduced me to Agent Patricia from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Attorney Michael from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation had expanded rapidly once multiple insurance companies reported coordinated fraud attempts involving the same fabricated death. Ms. Amanda Harrison has created an extensive criminal enterprise built around maintaining her mother's false death while collecting insurance benefits, Agent Patricia explained. Forged death certificates, fraudulent accident reports, false medical documentation, and systematic insurance fraud spanning 6 years. The evidence was overwhelming and sophisticated. Amanda had established relationships with corrupt staff at multiple care facilities, creating a network for moving Sarah between institutions while maintaining the fiction of brain damage that prevented her from revealing the truth. We've also discovered that Amanda has power of attorney documents giving her legal authority over Sarah's care and medical decisions, Attorney Michael added. Sarah's been drugged with medication that affects memory formation and cognitive function, keeping her confused about her identity and location. Detective Morrison spread additional evidence across his desk, photographs of Amanda visiting various facilities, financial records showing insurance payments and care facility expenses, correspondence with medical staff who'd been bribed to maintain false patient records. The scheme was remarkably comprehensive, Agent Patricia noted. Fake Sarah's death, collect life insurance, hide her in long-term care while drugging her into compliance, and file supplemental insurance claims for ongoing expenses. But what Amanda didn't understand was that she'd targeted someone with intimate knowledge of exactly these types of criminal schemes. I'd investigated similar cases for decades, understood every technique she was using, recognized every pattern in her fraudulent behavior. The investigation had also revealed that Sarah wasn't Amanda's first victim. Similar patterns appeared in the deaths of 2 elderly clients at the legal firm where Amanda worked as a paralegal, both involving suspicious accident reports and expedited insurance settlements. The trap was almost ready. That evening felt surreal when Amanda called to check on my emotional stability, her voice carrying the same concerned affection she'd used for 6 years while systematically stealing insurance money and keeping her own mother imprisoned in medical facilities. "Hi, Dad. I just wanted to see how you're feeling today. Have you been having any more of those vivid dreams about Mom? Dr. Peterson thinks they might be signs of unresolved grief affecting your sleep patterns." I could hear the calculation behind her concerned tone. Amanda was probably monitoring my behavior, wondering if I was becoming suspicious about Sarah's death, calculating whether she needed to adjust her story or move Sarah to another facility. "Actually, Amanda, I had some very interesting conversations today," I replied calmly, "with some investigators, with an FBI agent, with an attorney from the State Attorney General's office." There was a long pause before she responded, and I could practically hear her mental gears spinning as she tried to assess whether her 6-year fraud scheme had been detected by law enforcement. "Dad, that sounds concerning. What kind of investigators?" "The kind who specialize in insurance fraud, staged deaths, and systematic financial exploitation. They seemed very interested in your mother's death certificate and the insurance claims you've been filing for 6 years. Amanda's breathing had become rapid and shallow. She was realizing that her elaborate criminal enterprise had been completely uncovered by investigators who understood fraud schemes far better than she did. "Dad, I think you might be confused about what happened. Amanda said desperately. Mom died in that accident. You were there for the funeral. Maybe I should come over so we can look at the documentation together. But her voice was shaking now. Amanda understood that her criminal operation was collapsing, that federal agents were probably preparing arrest warrants while we spoke. She was losing control. That night, the calm before Amanda's destruction felt heavy with 6 years of stolen grief and rage at her betrayal of everything Sarah and I had built together. I sat in our bedroom, holding Sarah's wedding ring that Amanda had returned to me as a keepsake, reviewing the comprehensive evidence file the investigators had assembled. The investigation had revealed that Amanda's fraud was even more extensive than initially discovered. Over 6 years, she'd collected $250,000 in life insurance money while spending approximately $180,000 on Sarah's care at various facilities, pocketing $70,000 while keeping her own mother drugged and confused. Mr. Harrison, Agent Patricia had explained during our final briefing, Amanda has been systematically drugging Sarah with medications that affect memory formation and cognitive function, keeping her disoriented about time, location, and identity. The evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple insurance fraud. Amanda had been willing to let me suffer through 6 years of grief while keeping Sarah imprisoned in medical facilities, drugged into compliance, confused about her own identity. I thought about our 42 years together, the retirement we'd planned, the grandchildren Sarah would never see grow up because Amanda had stolen 6 years of our lives for money. Tomorrow morning, federal and state agents would arrest Amanda on charges that would send her to prison for decades. Craig would discover that his wife was a career criminal who'd been torturing her own mother while collecting insurance money. But I wanted Amanda to understand exactly who she'd chosen to deceive, exactly what investigative expertise she'd attempted to manipulate before her arrest ended any possibility of family reconciliation forever. Tomorrow, everything would change. But the confrontation came quietly when I invited Amanda to a family meeting at Riverside Manor, ostensibly to discuss moving forward with Sarah's care plan that she'd been pushing me to approve. Her relief was obvious as she approached the conference room, probably calculating that she could manage any remaining suspicions I might have developed. "Dad, I'm so glad you're finally being realistic about Mom's condition," Amanda began, settling into her familiar chair at the polished table surrounded by nursing staff and facility administrators. "The doctors have been very clear that her brain injury prevents normal memory formation." Craig nodded sympathetically from across the table, while the facility administrator pulled out care planning documents that would have given Amanda even more control over Sarah's treatment and medication regimen. "She's been particularly agitated lately," Amanda continued, consulting her notes with practiced concern, claiming she remembers details from before the accident, insisting that she has a different name. The confusion is unfortunately progressing. I looked at her calmly across the table, where she'd spent 3 months manipulating medical staff into believing Sarah was a brain-damaged patient rather than a drugged victim of insurance fraud. "Amanda, before we sign any care plans, there are some people I'd like you to meet," I said quietly. The conference room door opened, and Agent Patricia stepped inside, followed by Detective Morrison and Attorney Michael from the State Attorney General's office. Their badges were clearly visible as they took positions around the table. "Ms. Amanda Harrison," Agent Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "we need you to remain seated while we explain why we're here." The room went completely silent. Nurses froze mid-conversation. The administrator's face turned gray with sudden understanding. Craig looked confused, glancing between the agents and his wife with growing alarm. Amanda's face went from confident to terrified in the span of 3 seconds. She looked at me, searching for the grieving, confused old man she thought she'd been manipulating for 6 years. I simply folded my hands on the table and smiled quietly. I'd seen this moment 100 times during my career. The instant a fraudster realized their scheme had been completely exposed. This time, it was personal. "Ms. Harrison, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, elder abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to file fraudulent death certificates," Agent Patricia announced. "You have the right to remain silent." She realized what I truly was, and justice came quietly the next morning when federal agents completed Amanda's arrest at Riverside Manor. Agent Patricia called to inform me that Amanda had been charged with 23 federal counts related to her elaborate fraud scheme. "Amanda Harrison is facing 25 to 30 years in federal prison," Agent, Patricia explained. The systematic nature of the fraud, the elder abuse elements, and the drugging without consent carry mandatory minimum sentences. Sarah was released from the facility that afternoon, confused but gradually recovering as the psychiatric medications cleared from her system. Walking into her room, seeing her face for the first time in 6 years, I felt something break inside my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been holding together. "Walter," she said when she saw me, her voice uncertain but her eyes showing the first glimmer of recognition. "They said you were dead. They showed me newspaper clippings about your accident. For 6 years, I'd believed I was a widower. I'd learned to sleep alone, to eat alone, to live with the constant ache of missing the woman I'd loved for 42 years. I'd visited her grave every Sunday, talking to a headstone that marked an empty plot. Meanwhile, she was alive and terrified, drugged into confusion in medical facilities. "I'm here, Sarah. I've been looking for you without knowing you were still alive," I whispered, taking her hand for the first time since Amanda had shown me that forged death certificate. The hardest part was explaining that our daughter, our child, whom we'd raised with love and pride, had stolen 6 years of our lives together for $250,000 in insurance money, that the young woman who'd cried at Sarah's funeral had been planning to keep us separated forever. 6 months later, Sarah and I moved to a small house near the ocean, far from the memories of Amanda's betrayal. Sarah's recovery has been slow. The medications Amanda had them giving her affected her memory formation, and some details from the missing years may never return completely. But every morning when I wake up next to her, when I hear her humming in our new yellow kitchen, I'm reminded that some investigations take years to complete, but always reach the same conclusion. The truth emerges, no matter how deeply it's buried. Sometimes I think about Amanda in federal prison, serving what will likely be the rest of her productive life behind bars. I don't feel satisfaction about her punishment, just a quiet sadness that my own daughter could calculate that my grief was worth $250,000. Craig visits occasionally with our grandchildren. They're too young to understand why their mother will be in prison until they're adults, but old enough to know that Grandpa Walter caught a very bad person who was hurting their grandmother. The federal charges ensured that Amanda would never be able to exploit another elderly victim. Other families would be protected from the kind of sophisticated cruelty she'd perfected. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply allowing the truth to emerge after years of systematic deception. Amanda had calculated that a retired investigator wouldn't investigate his own wife's supposed death when presented with official documentation during emotional crisis. She had learned too late that professional expertise doesn't disappear with retirement, and that love, real love, never stops searching for the truth, even when hope seems impossible. But justice stays silent, patient, and inevitable as the tide returning home.